Since I've reviewed season one along with season two of Andor, I thought it would make sense for me to go ahead and do my review of Andor season three. Rogue One. But, anyways, yeah, so I watched Rogue One when it first came out in the theaters, nearly a decade ago. And I've yet to actually do a review of it, even though I have quite a few Star Wars movie and TV show reviews in my Star Wars playlist, including the entire Star Wars saga, episode 1, 2, 3, all the way to even the sequel trilogy, if you want my opinions about those. And we're also going to add Rogue One to the ranks and maybe even squeeze in Solo there. I'm not going to do a Solo review, but I'll at least put it in the rank, right, where I would place it between the movies in the saga. In case you're interested in my reviews as well as how I rank the Star Wars films, and you'll see that in just a moment. I'll probably do that right before the spoilers. So there will be spoilers in case there's some of you that have yet to watch Rogue One. It's nearly a decade old. I don't know why you haven't watched it yet. I would highly recommend it. In my opinion, it is the best Disney era Star Wars film. I know that's not really saying much, but in its own right, I think that Rogue One is a great movie. And in my opinion, I think it does serve as a series finale for the Andor series, from season one to season two. And if you want to consider this to be season three, I'm fine with that. I'm sure most people feel that way as well. So it came out in 2016 with directors Gareth Edwards. They also brought on Tony Gilroy, who ended up leading the work on Andor. So Tony Gilroy has been involved since Rogue One. And I'm so glad they brought him back for Andor, because I don't think Andor would have worked without Tony Gilroy. There's so many characters in Rogue One. There's such an ensemble. And I know I'm not going to mention everybody, but a few of them real quick. Some of them you know from the Star Wars saga. Some of them you know from Andor. Some of them you already know specifically from this movie. We got Cassian Andor. We have Jyn Erso, along with her dad, Galen Erso. Director Krennic, Mon Mothma, K2SO, Saul Guerrera, Bel Organa, Darth Vader, Grand Moff Tarkin, along with Bodhi, who was an Imperial defector. And then we had the Guardians of the Whills, including Chirrut, along with Baze. And then we even had some cool cameos. We have some other cameos I really didn't care for. I'll talk about those cameos later. But the two cool cameos that I actually liked, and yeah, this is kind of a small spoiler, especially if you watch New Hope, is we got gold and red leader cameos, and I thought that was well done. So props Disney for putting them in there. And they used deleted footage from A New Hope for those cameos. I think that worked rather well. But yeah, I absolutely loved Rogue One when I first watched it. It was different because it starts off with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and you're expecting like the Star Wars opening with John Williams' score and the scroll, but that doesn't happen. At first, I'm like, what? It just took me a moment. It's like, where's the opening? Where's the scroll? Now, I know that this is a Star Wars story, and it's not technically part of the saga, but in kind of a way it is. I consider it to be now. Solo is, well, Solo. Like I said, I'm not going to review that. But before we go on the spoilers, yeah, I think that Rogue One is really good and even more enjoyable thanks to Andor season 1 and 2. And I think they work great as a trilogy. But you can also lump in A New Hope as well because, it's also directly connected with the events of Rogue One. So it all works together. Season 1 of Andor, Season 2 of Andor, and Rogue One, and of course, Star Wars A New Hope. But right there, those four, bam, nice package deal. And while you're at it, you might as well go ahead and watch Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. But yeah, I think the Rogue One easily probably the best Disney Star Wars movie they're ever going to make. And I know they're working on a few other projects right now, like Mandalorian and Grogu, and there's one or two others that are in the pipeline. We'll see how those turn out. Maybe they'll be good, but I don't think they'll reach the same level of Rogue One. And I hear rumors for the 10th anniversary that they're going to mix in some scenes from Andor into like a special edition for Rogue One. That might actually be interesting, and it's not unprecedented because George Lucas did the same thing with the original trilogy back in the 90s with mixed results. Some things I liked about it, some things I didn't. but hopefully if there is a hypothetical Rogue One special edition, including some scenes from Andor, I'm willing to go check it out in maybe a year from now for the 10th anniversary of Rogue One. All right, so before we go to the reviews, as promised, I want to go ahead and just tell you where I rank Rogue One. And as a courtesy to Solo fans, because I know there are some Solo fans out there, I'll go ahead and rank Solo as well compared to the other 9 movies. First place, we got A New Hope. Second place, Empire Strikes Back. Third place, Return of the Jedi. Fourth place, Revenge of the Sith. That's my top 4. But making up the top 5 now, I'm going to put Rogue One in the quote-unquote 4.5 spot. So I'm going to put that ahead of The Phantom Menace in the top 5, in case anybody's curious. So underneath Rogue One, we got Phantom Menace, Force Awakens, Attack of the Clones, and then underneath Attack of the Clones, I'm going to put Solo in quote-unquote 7.5 place because I still enjoy Solo more than Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, in case any of you are interested in how I rank the Star Wars movies. And no, I didn't mention the Star Wars Clone Wars movie because I consider it to be a pilot of the Clone Wars series. So I'm not going to add that to the rank. But if I was, I would probably put it maybe somewhere with Solo in that ballpark. It wasn't really that good. It had its moments, but the Clone Wars series was phenomenal. That's why I think it's better just to remember the Clone Wars movie as just a pilot, because usually pilots aren't the final product. They just give you an idea of what the series is going to be about. And if you're curious about why I rank this movie there and there and there, feel free and check out my other reviews for all my other Star Wars movies in case you're interested. Then that'll give you a better idea why I ranked Force Awakens higher than what some of you probably would have, or the way I did it with A New Hope being at the top of my list. I know a lot of people would put Empire higher, but once again, this is my ranking of the Star Wars films. FYI. And with that out of the way, let's get into spoilers. And by the way, I want to know your thoughts, views, and opinions regarding Rogue One. And how would you rank Rogue One with all the other Star Wars films? And if you want to include Solo and, yeah, even the Star Wars Clone Wars movie, feel free and let me know your rankings, views, and opinions of Rogue One below in the comment section. The main story of Rogue One takes place right before the events of A New Hope. In fact, they're basically connected together from the end of Rogue One to the beginning of A New Hope. Now, there's some backstory at the beginning. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I guess you could say the premise of Rogue One comes from the very first sentence in the opening crawl of A New Hope. It is a period of civil war. Rebel spaceships striking from a hidden base have won their first victory against the evil Galactic Empire. That sentence is basically the premise of Rogue One, and I'm so glad that Rogue One exists. It introduced some new characters that fill into the Star Wars universe rather nicely, especially with the Rebel Alliance. In the backstory, we got introduced to Galen Erso, his wife, along with their daughter Jen Erso, who becomes an important character in Rogue One. We also got introduced to a new baddie, Director Krennic of the Empire, and he's the guy that was tasked with building the Death Star all the way up to the very end when Tarkin just basically took it from him. But I found Krennic to be a very compelling antagonist. And we also get Tarkin along with Darth Vader. We also get to see a shadier side of the rebellion. Now, in the original trilogy, the Rebel Alliance are the good guys, and they're still the good guys, but you don't really think about them having to do some shady, gray, darker gray type stuff. But the reality is they have to. I mean, they're going up against overwhelming odds in the Galactic Empire. Now, the Galactic Empire are still the bad guys. They're evil. Make no mistake. But thanks to season 1 and 2 of Andor and, the actions of Cassian, yeah, these guys have to do some pretty shady stuff in order to take down the Empire, or at least have some hope of taking down the Galactic Empire. And we're introduced to Cassian Andor in the beginning of Rogue One, where he goes and meets, I believe, a member of the Partisans who has information regarding the Empire mining kyber crystals off of Jeddah. And that's connecting dots back to the final few episodes of season 2 of Andor, where they've learned about the Death Star. What Gorman was used for, the materials on Gorman that they were mining for, and why they did what they did. I talked about this in my season 2 review of Andor a few days ago. and also how it connects to the kyber crystals and to this secret weapon that the Empire has been building. Now, the informant gets killed by Andor because Andor has no choice but to kill him because there's Imperials all over the place. In fact, he had to kill 2 other Imperials prior to killing, I think his name was Tivik, I think. I could be wrong about that, but it just shows that Andor's willing to do some pretty bad things for the greater good, which ties into Luthen and Clea from season 1 and 2 of Andor, and a few others that were part of Luthen's faction, because they did some pretty dark stuff. But in order to push the rebellion, in order for it to survive and have a hope of defeating the Empire one day. So you see Andor doing bad stuff, but you also get introduced to Jyn Erso, who was orphaned. Her dad was taken by Krennic to go help finish building the Death Star. Her mom was killed, and Saw Gerrera rescued her. And so Saw Gerrera and the partisans raised her for a few years, and then Saw abandoned her around the time when she was 16. And then Saw later tells her why he had to abandon her, because he was afraid that other members of the partisans were going to find out about who she is, and they might end up like kidnapping her and using her for blackmail against the Empire. And he didn't want that. He was trying to protect Jyn because he had a friendship with her father, Galen Erso. So, they break Jyn out of Imperial prison because she's been in Imperial prison, I think over weapons. And she gets rescued by Cassian and KS-2O. And KS-2O is amazing. I love KS-2O. He's a great droid. He's a droid that has some smart-ass comments. And he's definitely a droid you'd want to take into combat with. So he was a reprogrammed Imperial droid. And slowly but surely, we get this team assembled together, from Cassian to Jyn to K2. And eventually we're introduced to the 2 Guardians of the Wills. Chirrut, who's a blind, force-sensitive guy who has like kung fu abilities or martial arts skills and a stick. And we also have his friend Baze, who's also a Guardian. And he's very good with like heavy weapons. And they're both like really good to be part of this team. And then we're also eventually introduced to Bodhi, the defector Imperial pilot, who was sent to warn the rebellion about the Empire's secret weapon by Galen Erso, because Galen has been working for Krennic on a secret base, but Galen is trying to find a way for the rebellion to destroy the Death Star. And he does put in the exhaust port that Luke ultimately uses in A New Hope to destroy the Death Star. So that was Galen's doing. But the rebellion now has a desperate push to try and learn more about the Empire's new secret weapon and hopefully get plans to destroy it. So they go to Jedha, Andor, Jyn, K2. They meet up with the 2 Guardians of the Wills, and then they go meet up with the partisans. And Saw Gerrera has just basically gone crazy at this point. He also kidnapped Bodhi, even though Bodhi came willingly to the partisans for the information. But Saul thinks everybody's spying against him and plotting against him. He's just basically lost it in his final days. I mean, it's been a slow, steady path for poor Saul. But at the end, Saul, lets them go. I mean, they basically break free on their own. But Saul just tells them, like, to save the dream, save the rebellion, as the Death Star is fired on the city of Jedha in a low test weapon shot, not the full blast that destroys Alderaan in A New Hope. But Krennic has a bit of a rivalry with Tarkin, and he's not exactly happy that after a decade or 2 of helping to lead like the development and construction of the Death Star, Krennic's basically been like pushed aside by Tarkin. Tarkin's just taken it over because he's the Grand Moff. He's one of the highest ranking officers in the Empire, right underneath the Emperor and Darth Vader. So Krennic's not happy about that. But now we see everything like going into motion. The attempt to rescue Galen from this Imperial base. But at the same time, you have General Draven ordering Andor to kill her father. So Jyn thinks they're going to save her father, Galen, but Andor's under orders by the rebellion general to kill him. So Andor feels this conflict, right? Because he's been fighting the Empire for decades now. And he has had to do some pretty terrible things. And we see some of those terrible things done under Luthen in season 1 and 2 of Andor. And now you have someone like Jyn, who actually is an idealist, I guess you could say. She believes in the rebellion and she doesn't want to kill her father, and she's trying to convince Andor that, he's worth saving. And I think Andor in the end tries to save him as well, but unfortunately their U-wing crashes, and the rebellion sends a squadron of X-wings and I think Y-wings to destroy the base, and then there's a confrontation between Krennic and Galen, and some scientists get killed. And then, unfortunately, so does Galen. He gets mortally wounded before he's briefly reunited with his daughter. And, there's some really touching moments, even though one's done by hologram from Galen to Jyn. And then in Galen's final moments, this father-daughter thing that I really do appreciate between Galen and Jyn. I like that. The fact that, she was his world, his stardust, as he called her. And, I guess that emotion is why Jyn is so determined to help the rebellion find these Death Star plans in order to hopefully destroy the station. And so the climax is obviously going to be at Scarif, the ground battle, the space battle. And overall, this feels like Star Wars, but it's also darker and grittier and even feels more real because, almost everybody we're introduced to in Rogue One, these new characters, they don't survive. Andor dies, Jyn dies, Galen dies, Bodhi dies, Baze dies, Chirrut dies. They all die. And everyone else that dies on the ground team of Rogue One. And a lot of pilots end up dying. A lot of ships are destroyed in the battle above Scarif in order to get those Death Star plans from the Empire. Of course, Krennic also dies. No loss there. That's one thing I really did appreciate about this movie is the fact that sacrifices in war have to be made and not everybody comes out alive. And those that do survive end up being scarred. And all the hard work that was done by the Rebel Alliance going forward in New Hope and Empire and Return of the Jedi, it was thanks to what was done in Rogue One and Andor Season 1 and 2 and the first acts of rebellion after the Empire came into being. Even if it was just small acts of defiance like Maeve's speech or Mon Mothma's speech in the Imperial Senate, or everything else that was done in between. But obviously, despite the sacrifices made by almost everybody, including Jyn and Andor, the plans do get beamed up to Admiral Raddus's ship before it's disabled, and the rebellion's able to get the plans to Leia's ship, Tantive 4, which is Bail Organa's ship, which is docked inside Raddus's ship, and they're able to briefly escape the Empire. And this leads to one of the most amazing Darth Vader scenes in all Star Wars, the hallway scene with the rebels. And at one in the hallway where it's dark, you start hearing breathing. And you know who it is. It's Vader. And then all of a sudden you see his red lightsaber go on. And then the rebels desperately trying to kill him to no avail. He's using the Force to throw their weapons and disable them and lift them into the air and stab them and run them through with his lightsaber, just cutting them down like they're nothing while they're desperately trying to get the plans to the other side of the door so that the Tantive 4 can escape the battle. But that was an amazing scene. And it's great that we finally got to see something like that, Darth Vader at his most brutal, because a lot of the times it's just Vader walking around, Force choking somebody, getting into a lightsaber fight with Obi-Wan, then getting into a lightsaber fight with Luke, and then another lightsaber fight with Luke, and then dying. This time, you actually get a small taste of what Vader has been doing since Episode 3 under the service of the Emperor. Some pretty horrific stuff. And these are probably not the first insurgents or rebels or traitors or whatever you want to call them that have met their brutal, tragic, horrific end at the hands and the lightsaber of Darth Vader. There's probably been plenty between Episode 3 and Episode 4. And once again, I did really appreciate them mixing in some small cameos from Gold Leader and Red Leader. It works rather well. And we find out why Luke is Red 5, because the original Red 5 dies in the Battle of Scarif, and why there isn't a Blue Squadron, even though I think in the original movie there was going to be a Blue Squadron, but then they just changed it, to Red Squadron and Gold Squadron. I think it was because of limitations back then when it came to special effects. Blue Squadron basically gets obliterated in the Battle of Scarif, along with a few other ships. Now, obviously, this is not my favorite Star Wars movie of all time. I know some people might disagree with that. That's why I put it in fifth. Well, technically fifth, right? Or quote-unquote 4.5. My top 5. Because it's not perfect, but it's also going up against four of the movies I absolutely love, like the original trilogy, including Revenge of the Sith. So I feel like it's great in that fifth spot, or that 4.5 spot. But there are some cons, I would say. For one thing, the cameos. Yeah, as much as I like the red and gold leader cameos, I felt like that made sense because they were in command of Gold and Red Squadron prior to A New Hope in the Battle of Yavin. There's other cameos that were unnecessary. For example, Dr. Cornelius and Panda Baba, like, just happen to be on Jeddah, and they say that he says the same line he says to Luke in the cantina on Tatooine. Only a few days later, by the way. So he goes from Jeddah, these two criminals with death warrants on several systems, I think 12 systems. They're on Jeddah, and then they somehow end up on Tatooine, of all places. And then they run into Luke in the cantina. And then Dr. Cornelius gets cut down by Obi-Wan. I mean, what are the freaking odds? The galaxy is huge. I felt like that cameo was unnecessary. And the other cameo that was unnecessary was R2 and C-3PO. But GB, you already said that Tantive 4 is in the movie. Yeah, it's in the movie. But was there really enough time for R2 and C-3PO to load onto a ship and get onto Tantive 4 in order to go into the Battle of Scarif? Wouldn't they already be on Tantive 4 under Captain Antilles? We know that Bail Organa goes to Alderaan, right? But I don't think he takes Tantive 4 to Alderaan, because that makes no sense, because Tantive 4 ends up aboard Radish's ship, or Dr. Radish's ship, because it's much larger than Tantive 4, with Leia and Captain Antilles and R2 and C-3PO. So it really made no sense for them to be on the ground at the Rebel base in Yavin. But I guess you could kind of forgive that one because people love R2 and C-3PO. And then let's talk about the CGI. The Leia CGI at the end, yeah, it could have been better. I understand why they did it, because they wanted to have Leia at the very end. And we obviously see her aboard the Tantive 4 at the beginning of New Hope when she's being boarded by Darth Vader whenever her ship's captured by his Imperial Star Destroyer. That obviously makes sense. So they wanted to have Leia there. But the CGI does have a bit of an uncanny valley to it that can be forgiven, I suppose. If they do that hypothetical special edition of Rogue One we talked about, I hope they go back and they improve the CGI for her character. They make it a little bit more believable than it was nearly a decade ago. And the same thing for Tarkin. I think they put a lot of work into Tarkin, and I'm glad they did all the work they did for Tarkin. They got the likeness. They got somebody that sounded like Tarkin for the voice work, and somebody like standing for Tarkin that has a similar build. So they put a lot of effort into the Rogue One version of Tarkin. And we know why he's there. It's necessary. He's the Grand Moff. You know, he's the one you think about when you think of the Death Star, along with Darth Vader. So Tarkin had to be in the movie. But a decade later, it's just, I guess, not as good as you remember it at first. And I thought it was okay when I first watched it on the big screen a decade ago. But it's definitely better than the Jabba scene with Han in A New Hope Special Edition. So at least there's that. But maybe they could rework those CGIs for a Rogue One Special Edition, along with some scenes from Andor. Maybe for the 10th anniversary Disney, that would be nice. And my last con that I have is as a Dark Forces fan who played through the Dark Forces games, including the first one. By the way, I did do a Dark Forces playthrough, over a year ago, because the remaster came out. Look, I like Kyle Katarn and Jan Ors. They were the ones who originally stole the Death Star plans back in the 90s. And I know it may have never been officially Star Wars canon, but I feel like something's been taken away from Kyle and Jan. But it's okay, because I still have those memories of playing Dark Forces and, Jedi Knight and the other Jedi Knight games. But at the same time, I mean, damn, they did Kyle and Jan dirty. But on the flip side, I do like Andor. I like Jyn Erso. I like everyone else that makes up the cast of Rogue One, including Andor Season 1 and 2. So I guess it was a price willing to be paid, because Rogue One is such a good Disney Star Wars movie. It's the best Disney Star Wars movie by far. And I feel like it's worthy of being one of the better Star Wars films, like I already ranked. And more importantly, I love Andor Season 1 and 2. I absolutely love those two seasons. I think that is basically Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad in Star Wars. That's how I feel about Andor Season 1 and 2. And I consider Rogue One to be basically Andor Season 3. And I guess you could say A New Hope is Andor Season 4. Except for they killed off the main characters, and they brought in some farm boy, and they brought in some uppity princess, and a smuggler of a big giant walking dog. Oh, and they also recast Ewan McGregor with some older guy to be Obi-Wan. What the F, Disney? But anyways, there's my thoughts, views, and opinions and review of Rogue One. Absolutely love this movie. Still holds up nearly 10 years later. And yeah, if there is a special edition that comes out in a year from now to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of Rogue One, I'll definitely go watch it. How would you rank Rogue One with the rest of the Star Wars movies? And your thoughts, views, and opinions regarding Rogue One, welcome, as always, below in the comments section.